Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry to interrupt all the great conversations, but we are eager to get on to our afternoon program also. This is Trinity, so we keep stuffing our brains full of great intellectual content, don't we? So we are so privileged to have Dr. Stephen Schneck with us this afternoon, and he will be introduced by Dr. Stephen Gable of our philosophy department. These are eminent philosophers, political philosophers, ethicists. Dr. Schneck is currently the chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Previously, he was a great colleague over at Catholic University. I have been with him on numerous occasions, and I'm always dazzled by his brilliance. So, without further ado, we have Dr. Stephen Gable, and our student Lauren Woodhouse is up here to ask questions following the presentation. But Dr. Gable.
Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Stephen Schneck, chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, a bipartisan U.S. government commission established in 1998 by the International Religious Freedom Act to monitor violations of religious freedom and make policy recommendations to the U.S. President and to Congress. A political philosopher by training, Dr. Schneck retired from the Catholic University of America in 2018 after more than 30 years as a professor, department chair, and dean. At the university, he was also the founder and longtime director of the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies. A well-known advocate for Catholic social justice teachings in public life, Dr. Schneck currently serves on the governing boards of Catholic Climate Covenant, which advocates for environmental justice and care for creation, and of Catholic Mobilizing Network, a Catholic organization working to end the death penalty and advance restorative justice. Previously, he was the executive director of Franciscan Action Network, which promotes environmental, economic, racial, and social justice on behalf of the Franciscan communities of the United States. He served the administration of President Barack Obama as a member of the White House Advisory Council for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. He earned his baccalaureate degree at Rockhurst University and his doctorate at the University of Notre Dame. So could we please welcome Dr. Stephen Schneck.
Thank you, Professor Gable. Thanks for the kind introduction. I'm honored and a little bit more than a little humbled to be here this afternoon. Let me pay my particular thanks to President McGuire. I've admired President McGuire for many years. First from my perch across the street over there on Michigan Avenue at the Catholic University of America, and then from our mutual engagement on issues of religion and social justice in public life. Her work at Trinity has been inspiring. It's been a model of what universities can do in education that not only transforms students for their personal success, but transforms students for the common good of us all. So thank you, President McGuire. And I have to say, and at this particular moment, that I'm a very hard act to follow, and I'm a little bit daunted. Speaker Pelosi has been, an idol of mine for many years, and not only, may I say, is she deserves every kudos for being the first woman Speaker of the House of Representatives, but for being the best Speaker of the House in the history of the United States. And I have a very different talk than what you heard just a few minutes ago. This is more of a professor's talk on a serious issue facing our politics at this time. So I'm sorry to say there will be no jokes. I'm going to lead you through this quickly and somewhat intensely because it is so important. I'll pause a couple of times to answer questions, however, as I go through. As chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF as it's called, for the past few years it's been my responsibility to bear witness to a global epidemic of violence, persecution, and calculated discrimination directed at people because of what they believe or because of what they don't believe. I've met with victims, their representatives, and families in embassy rooms, places of worship, refugee camps, offices of NGOs, and government ministries. I've endured being surveilled openly and clandestinely by government operatives. I've been lectured to, often with pointed fingers, by various government officials and ambassadors. I've even been blacklisted from entry into some countries. What I've seen and witnessed personally should give pause to any who doubt the value of democracy's political order based on human rights. In particular, it has become utterly clear from my observations that rights of conscience, belief, faith, and religion are not only essential for human life, they are critical rights, even foundational rights for democracy and for any just political order. This is probably a good time for me to make clear that my talk today reflects my own thoughts and my own analysis. I'm not speaking today on behalf of USCIRF and certainly not representing the Commission or its work. I'm speaking in my private capacity. That said, I was appointed to the Commission by President Biden in the spring of 2022. Almost immediately, I was sent on a mission to assess the rights of refugees from Myanmar. Myanmar refugees suffer under brutal conditions in sanctioned and unsanctioned camps in Bangladesh, Thailand, India, and Malaysia. My particular mission was to Christian undocumented refugee communities in Malaysia and to the Muslim Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. Myanmar's refugees are victims of horrific religious persecution by militant Buddhist nationalism, a religious nationalism that metastasized in Myanmar over the last decade since seizing the government by coup in February of 2021. The US government has labeled this persecution a genocide, which speaks not only to the severity of the military violence the regime has used against its victims, but also to the government's systematic efforts to erase any religious culture contrary to Buddhism. Indeed, it was amidst a very emotional stay at the Rohingya refugee camp near Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh that the clear linkage between religious nationalism and such persecution became obvious to me. It was there that I became convinced that religious nationalism poses a profound danger to human rights and democracy, and indeed poses a threat to religion itself. What is religious nationalism? Well, as the Myanmar case demonstrates, it is the national weaponizing of one religion to marginalize or repress other religions, to stifle freedom, and to enhance political power. In stifling freedoms, such as freedom of religion, and concentrating and enhancing political power, religious nationalism foments authoritarianism and erodes democracy. From that initial insight in Cox's Bazar, the dire global situation for the freedoms of conscience, belief, faith, and religion came into stark relief for me. Numerous organizations have tracked a frightening spike in government's infringements of such freedoms over the last decade or so. USERF tracks this, so does the State Department, so too does the United Nations and many NGOs. At the Cox's Bazar camps, I perceived how closely this spike was associated with surging, and let's be frank, mostly right-wing religious nationalism. To be clear, religious nationalism is not the only threat to religious liberty. Countries like North Korea, for example, simply seek to eliminate all religions. China only allows religions that are controlled by the state. The Ortega regime's persecutions of Catholics in Nicaragua is not really associated with promotion of something like religious nationalism. Likewise, the increasingly violent conflict between the Muslim Fulani herders and the Christian villagers in Nigeria is also not driven by religious nationalism. That said, in many other countries, the erosion of the rights of conscience, belief, faith, and religion is clearly associated with religious nationalism, as I'll explore this afternoon with examples from India and from Hungary. While many other countries in many other countries, you'll see religious nationalism as a contributing factor. For example, in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church has been weaponized by Vladimir Putin to repress other religions and to prop up his authoritarianism, and also, frankly, to bless his invasion of Ukraine. In fact, of the 28 countries identified by USERF, either as countries of particular concern or recommended for the State Department's special watch list, fully half reflect situations where religious nationalism is a significant factor. And well beyond USERF's current lists, religious nationalist movements are active in dozens of other countries around the globe, including the United States and much of Europe. Let me pause and see if there are any general questions about this before I turn to the specific case of India. Would anyone have a question at this time? Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, you would like the list of the countries that are examples of other countries in which you see this? Yes. For example, Turkey would be a clear example. Okay, so the commission is composed of 9 commissioners who are appointed by the President and Congress. It's a bipartisan commission with 5 appointed by the party of the President and 4 appointed by the other party. And so currently we are 5 Democratic appointees and 4 Republican appointees. And we work with the International Freedom Office in the State Department, and we work internationally with representatives of various countries that are also involved in the focus on this particular area. Thank you. All right, let me turn now to the situation of India. Since I don't have visuals here, just kind of call to your mind a picture of whatever picture of India seems to work for you. For me, it's dusty streets, crowded streets, and quite a bit of heat. But whatever, imagine that if I had a slide here in the background to give us something to go on. In 1992, Hindu mobs, intent on constructing a temple to the god Ram on the site, destroyed the famed Babri Mosque in Ayodhya, which prompted years of sectarian violence, leaving thousands dead. The razing of the mosque became a template for what was called bulldozer justice, a term used to justify Hindu lynching of minority religious men accused of cow slaughter, the beating of interfaith couples, and the demolishing of non-Hindu homes by government authorities. That same mosque destruction also fueled a militant Hindu nationalism, Hindutva, that spurred the rise of the BJP party and brought Prime Minister Narendra Modi to power. Last fall, Modi led national celebrations in the inauguration of an enormous, newly constructed temple to Ram on the site of that former mosque. Modi's government, as well as state and local governments in India, are directly involved in implementing religiously discriminatory policies, passing laws that target religious conversion, interfaith relationships, the wearing of hijabs, and similar laws that negatively impact non-Hindu religions. This includes Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, other minority religions, as well as the practices of indigenous peoples and tribes. The government also censors critics of Hindu nationalism by surveillance and harassment. And under the umbrella of national security, the Indian government seeks to repress both domestic and international civil society organizations that advocate for religious freedom, like USER. For example, dozens of cases remain pending against individuals for involvement in the 2019 peaceful protests against the Citizenship Act. And this act, by the way, is a discriminatory law designed to block any path towards citizenship for non-Hindu immigrants, and perhaps also to make non-Hindu minorities stateless if they lack sufficient documentation. The governments of India, moreover, consistently fail to hold accountable Hindu nationalist vigilante mobs that terrorize and attack religious communities. In the last few years alone, destruction of property, including places of worship, predominantly in Muslim and Christian neighborhoods, has risen dramatically. Many Muslim homes have been destroyed. Several Muslim madrasas were razed after government officials in the state of Assam called for their destruction. Instances of sexual violence against Muslim women is too often not prosecuted, even in some cases when such attacks have been broadcast on social media. In 2022, Hindu nationalists bulldozed a Catholic center in Mangalore and attacked, looted, and destroyed the homes of hundreds of Christians for their refusal to convert to Hinduism. In 2023, more than 200 Christian churches were destroyed in Manipur, both Protestant and Catholic, as well as 2 synagogues. The government appears to show little interest in prosecuting those involved in this violence. Government officials are often seen employing disinformation and hate speech on social media platforms against religious minorities. Transnationally, the Indian government has been indicated in the assassination of a Sikh leader in Canada and in an attempted assassination or assassination plot against another Sikh leader here in the United States. So, Hindu nationalism in India, it seems, follows a particular pattern. There was originally and historically religious hatreds really clustered in fringe extremist groups dating back to colonial times in India. That hatred was normalized by a charismatic leader as religious nationalism. And then subsequently, that religious nationalism is used to advance an illiberal political agenda. To what extent, though, is this pattern found elsewhere in the world, where religious nationalism is growing? For example, might an otherwise secular nationalism merely use religious nationalism in a more instrumental fashion to justify its illiberalism? This brings me to the case of Hungary. The overt governmental persecution of minority religions and the intercommunal violence that marks religious nationalism in India is not on display in Hungary. Hungary is not on USERF's special watch list, not one of our countries of particular concern. Likewise, for organizations that rank countries on the basis of religious liberty, Hungary is typically ranked middling high, somewhat below the rest of Europe, but in many cases above much of the rest of the world. Yet Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his utterly dominant Fidesz party speak openly in support of Christian nationalism. Incidents of tension with minority religions are evident, as are examples of discriminatory governmental policies, as also are violence and harassment at institutions and individuals belonging to minority faiths. Both anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bias have risen in that country. The politics of Hungary over the last 2 decades has been defined by a number of obvious concerns that should be considered here. Think of these as rationales or explanations. Foremost is the migration crisis that is impacting so much of Europe. Successive events in the Middle East since the Gulf Wars have driven millions of mostly Muslim refugees to seek security and a better life in Europe. Likewise, climate change and regional violence in North Africa and the Sahel are also inclining large numbers of, again, mostly Muslim migrants toward Europe. Even relatively welcoming countries such as Germany and Sweden have had their politics roiled by this influx, and Hungary was especially on the front line of waves of refugees fleeing Syria and northern Iraq. Hungarian right-wing parties adopted a hard-line stance against this influx and against refugees themselves, pushing policies that blocked and expelled many and that targeted even legally admitted migrants for discrimination. Numerous examples of individual violence against migrants and minority religions and their ethnic populations were noted. A second factor to consider is a suspicion of liberal Western values and institutions in rural areas, among the working class and among pensioners. Politically, this manifests as a hostility in some parts of Hungary toward Western Europeans and their support for diversity, such as gay rights, DEI policies, and multiculturalism generally. For some, I suspect this suspicion is lingering nostalgia for the presumed stability of things before the fall of the Iron Curtain. But there are current realities that may inform that as well. High youth unemployment in Hungary, a widening income gap, smokestack industries struggling to compete in the global economy, and anxiety on the part of pensioners regarding the state's provisions of income, housing, and medical care. And finally, a third factor to consider: anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has an ancient history in Hungary that in some ways was unleashed anew after the fall of communism. We should not forget that Hungary was allied with Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy before and during the Second World War. Its troops fought alongside the Wehrmacht in a number of theaters. In the 1930s, Hungary passed laws, anti-Jewish laws, that were directed and inspired by similar measures in Germany. In 1944, Hitler sent German troops to occupy Hungary in order to bolster its resistance to the invading Soviet forces, but at the same time, Hungary began mass deportation of Jews from Hungary to Auschwitz and to Birkenau. All told, Hungarian authorities ultimately sent nearly 500,000 Jews to the death camps. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, extremist anti-Semitic groups emerged with varying degrees of success in Hungarian politics. Over the last decade and a half, anti-Semitism has escalated and to a certain extent been normalized publicly. Right-wing extremists and neo-Nazi gatherings attract large audiences in public venues. There are reports of Jewish cemeteries being vandalized, and prominent Jews report harassment. George Soros is regularly a punching bag in Hungarian media as a representative of an alleged international Jewish conspiracy. The Anti-Defamation League, in fact, identifies Hungary today as the most anti-Semitic country in Europe, with more than 40% of the population reporting some level of anti-Semitic inclination. With these factors as context, let me now turn specifically to the Christian nationalism of Viktor Orban and the Fidesz party. Coming to power first in 2010, it's unclear precisely when the features of Orban's Christian nationalism gelled. However, in 2012, the preamble to the Hungarian constitution was amended to declare that Hungary was founded as a Christian nation and as part of Christian Europe, and that Christianity has a role in preserving its nationhood. In 2015, the Orban government passed stringent laws designed to limit asylum for Muslim refugees and built a border fence to block their entry. At the same time, he proudly declared that Hungary was not liberal, but was instead and I'm quoting him here, an illiberal democracy. And he criticized what he called multiculturalism, which he defined as, and this is a quote again, coexistence of Islam, Asian religions, and Christianity. He goes on to say, we will do everything to spare Hungary from that, unquote. In 2019, he stated that and again I'm quoting here, the essence of illiberal democracy, remember that's what he wants, is Christian liberty and the protection of Christian liberty. Additional constitutional revisions in 2018 and 2020 redefined Hungary as a Christian nation and obligated all government agencies to promote Christian culture. In 2022, in the wake of an uproar following his remarks criticizing race mixing, Orban, of all places at a CPAC convention in Texas, called for Christian nationalists in Europe and the United States to, I'm quoting here, unite our forces to defend the fundamental values of Christian civilization. Different from Hindu nationalism in India, I see the Christian nationalism of Hungary not as particularly organic. Rather, I see it as an intentional weaponization of religion to advance or to market a political movement. By all accounts, Orban was for most of his life an agnostic. Hungary itself in modern times has never been an intensely religious country, even today, despite the meme of religious nationalism used by its political leaderships. Christian church attendance in Hungary is among the lowest in Europe. So, arguably, Orban and the Fidesz leadership found Christian nationalism to be an effective appeal amidst Hungarian identity politics and to baptize their anti-Muslim policies. Because let's face it, these kinds of religious nationalism, Christian nationalism, can be used to invoke an almost tribal identity of us versus them and suspicion of what is different or other. It's easy to imagine how this overlays with the Fidesz party's tensions with Western Europe and its opposition to globalism. But that in no way diminishes the very real danger that Hungary's Christian nationalism poses to freedom of religion and belief. The escalation of incidences of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred in Hungary is surely not coincidental. Moreover, in recent years, other minority religions are also being impacted, including independent Protestant churches, Scientologists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others. Now, India and Hungary are just two examples illustrating a worldwide escalation of religious nationalism, and examples, too, of the threat that religious nationalism poses to the rights of religion and belief, and ultimately, the danger that they pose to democracy. I could just as easily have spoken of dozens of other countries as illustration. What's happening is real and should concern us. The freedoms of conscience, religion, and belief are in many ways canaries in the coal mine for authoritarian threats to the democratic political order. Similarly, these rights are on the front lines for defense against religious nationalism. In fact, in speaking out for religious freedom, people of faith also lend their voice in support of a democratic order based on rights and liberties, an order that is now under siege in country after country by an authoritarian tide that neuters rights and freedoms because it fears citizens finding some source of truth or authority that might compromise the power of the dear leader or his party. Yet there are a few challenges facing my call for people of faith to stand up and play that role. In the first place, democracies around the world must somehow rediscover and recommit to the importance of these fundamental rights. The historical recognition of these rights in the 17th and 18th century, following the religious wars of the 16th, is too often a foggy memory for those today to worry about the cause of religious nationalism. Focused as our times have been on substantive rights like health care and social justice, the more formal rights and freedoms that are foundational for democracy have slipped from our attention span. In some quarters, formal rights are even viewed askance to the extent that they're seen as procedural obstacles that need to be sidestepped for speedy transformation toward social justice. Yet, democracy's foundational rights and freedoms are targets currently for political movements like religious nationalism that would set that cause of social justice back centuries. Related and secondly, the ability to speak for the freedoms of conscience, religion, belief is itself under assault and limited. Globally, we see laws ostensibly to combat terrorism, hate speech, or to preserve social and religious harmony. We see these laws being used to curb authentic calls for freedom of religion or belief. Vigilante mobs on social media can be just as effective as governmental action in squelching such calls. Even democracies can see rights succumb to popular tyrannies. And finally, even religious defenders of human rights and its political order are sometimes loath to take up the cause of religious freedom. In the public mind, religion has unfortunately become associated with the political right amidst the political polarization of our times. And those on the left are often too uncomfortable in speaking out for religion in any capacity. I'd argue that has to change. You've all been patient, hanging in there. Let me conclude by reiterating the essence of my argument. So, it goes like this. Religious nationalism is surging around the world. Religious nationalism suppresses religious freedom. Religious freedom is essential for human rights. Human rights are foundational for democracy. So as religious nationalism surges, democracy retreats, and authoritarianism grows. Religious believers can be a powerful voice for religious freedom and pushing back against religious nationalism. And by protecting religious freedom and pushing back against religious nationalism, people of faith protect human rights and promote democracy. We're gathered this afternoon in the nation's capital just days before the election. I believe we stand astride a global historical watershed. Rights, such as religious freedom, hang in the balance. Our political order based on such rights hangs in the balance. Democracy hangs in the balance. Distinguished guests, alumni, professors and students, President McGuire, it was an honor to speak with you today. We thank you kindly for your attention. As I've argued, for the sake of democracy, let's commit to affirming religious freedom. Thank you.
So I think I'll just, well, actually, this might be better after all. So I have a couple of questions that I would really like to hear you address. And thank you for that wonderful presentation. And then we'll take one question from our outstanding student representative, Lauren. But the first question I had, and I just wanted to get these two for sure. You noted that both autocrats and aspiring autocrats in various regions of the world have embraced religious nationalism. Could you say a little more about the function religious nationalism serves alongside other tools in the autocratic or authoritarian toolbox? What specific advantages do autocratic-leaning governments seek by encouraging and supporting religious nationalism?
Well, thank you, Professor. A good question. First of all, I think we can all see how the nature of religion is it appeals not only to the head, it appeals to the heart. In fact, I'm reminded of the new encyclical from Pope Francis that just came out that speaks exactly about the power of the heart. So religion is something that can grab the heart and grab it in a way that can be used by political leaders to concentrate their power and to marginalize those within their political order that they wish to marginalize. And so it's as you say, it's a tool in the toolbox of authoritarianism, precisely for concentrating power, for squeezing out the space within the populace to have appeal to something, beyond the authoritarian regime itself, to justify for the truth, for an argument for what's right. So I think that's really the way that it works, and it's religion is among the most powerful forces at work in the human soul. This is a way of getting political hooks into people's soul, using religion in this particular fashion, which I would argue is contrary to all religions, but nevertheless, it is a dangerous and effective means for authoritarians to employ.
Thank you very much. And I think this is maybe the most important question, at least in my opinion. But in recent years, we have heard several high-profile right-wing members of the United States Congress express their support for Christian nationalism, as they call it, They argue that the founders supported the establishment of an exclusively Christian nation and that the founders were not genuinely committed to the separation of church and state. What role do you think Christian nationalism plays in American politics today? Is its influence growing? And in your view, does American Christian nationalism represent a danger to fundamental American freedoms?
As I indicated in my talk, and I think as that we all know in this room, Christian nationalism is a thing in the United States. And very sadly, it's a growing thing, and it's also an extremely dangerous thing. I have no doubt that the vast majority of the framers and founders of our republic would roll over their graves with the arguments that we're hearing coming from some of the Christian nationalists right now. So any contention that there's something in the framing and founding of our government that in some ways is consonant with religious nationalism is dead wrong. Article 1 of our Constitution quite clearly lays out there the separation between church and state that is in fact so central for the thriving of religion in the United States. And it's one of the reasons that we have the wonderful diversity and richness of religious traditions in the United States is exactly this Article 1 that thanks to Madison and the other framers was written into the Constitution itself. I mean, that's the reality of the founding and framing period in that regard. I think there was more, though, to your question, right? What was the second part of your question?
Well, there are really two things that I see, as just an observer of what's happening. Number one, there's kind of an argument made that we need to go back to what the founders really intended to do, which was to establish a Christian nation. So there seems to be kind of this theme that we see in other political developments today, that we need to capture some, past almost species state that never really existed. But that's what we have to do. We have to, realize that the founders were never quite serious about separation of church and state. So you do see scholars who develop these arguments, and some politicians are citing these books and talking about this idea that, okay, they were never really serious about this in the first place. And I guess the second part is, in politics today in general, in American politics, I guess my second question would be, how do you see Christian nationalism being harnessed and used by political parties today to try to increase their power? I guess those would be my two questions.
I think that I've already answered the first pretty clearly. That I think that any fair reading of the writings of the founders and the framers of our republic, any fair reading would recognize just how wrong that basic argument of Christian nationalism is. It's wrong. The whole notion of the separation between church and state that's laid down in the Constitution and that's affirmed, by everyone from Jefferson to Ulysses S. Grant many years later. I mean, the reason that's laid down isn't to be against religion, but in fact, to allow religion to be separate from government so that it can, avoid government interference in the operation of religion. So it just doesn't. I think so. That's my answer, I think, to the first of your questions. The second question about how it's being used in the same way here in the United States that I see it being used in India, that I see it being used in Turkey, that I see it being used in. It hasn't reached these extremes, the way that it's being used in Myanmar, in Hungary, in Russia. I mean, it's being used in the same way, not at that level perhaps yet, but nevertheless, that's the intent. That what Putin realizes the value of using the Russian Orthodox Church to stir up passions in his people in defense of his invasion of Ukraine, that's the way Christian nationalism could be used, and is, I think, attempting to be used here in a similar kind of fashion to justify a particular agenda, political agenda, associated with the party or the individuals that are pursuing it. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll take a question from Lauren.
All right. First and foremost, thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts on such an important issue with us. My question is, religious nationalism in the United States is increasingly shaping the public perception of faith communities, and some members of Gen Z are finding it difficult to embrace religion when these communities are often associated with political movements that conflict with their personal values. What advice would you offer to young people who feel alienated by this politicization of religion but still seek a religious or spiritual identity?
Another good question. It always gives me such hope to hear from young people, with such knowledge about these things. So thank you. My answer is pretty much to repeat what I said in my talk, and that is, I think that Gen Zs and whatever the next generation is after that, I think they need to recognize we're not really so much talking about religion per se here as we are talking about the right to practice religion. We're talking about things like freedom of conscience. We're talking about freedom of belief. The Germans, in fact, they have they have a envoy similar to the envoy we have here in the United States that operates on to protect religious freedom abroad. They use the phrase Weltanschauungsfreiheit for religious freedom, and that translates better than it sounds. It means freedom to have any worldview you want. That's what we're talking about here. So freedom of religion isn't about the advocacy of religion. It's not about the promotion of religion. It's about creating that space and protecting that space in which you can believe what you want to believe, where you can choose for yourself faith or no faith, the worldview that is your worldview. That's what we're fighting for, and ultimately that's what religious nationalisms are trying to squeeze and to close.
Yeah, I'd like to know the role of the Catholic Church in Christian nationalism. Are they tacitly endorsing them? I'm not a Catholic anymore, but do they get any creds in the pulpit? Because I'm sure they feel there's something in there for them.
Good question. It's a mixed bag. Obviously, any reading of the documents coming out of the Vatican these days, whether it's the encyclicals of Pope Francis or the pronouncements of the folks that are at the Synod right now, you'll quickly see that there's nothing there in which we would find even the tiniest shred of support for religious nationalism, Christian nationalism in this case. And in fact, just today, maybe it's yesterday, just yesterday, the Bishop of Lexington, Kentucky just gave a powerful sermon criticizing Christian nationalism in this country and declaring it at odds with the Catholic faith. So we definitely have people like that. We can definitely say that the Catholic Church in no way endorses religious nationalism, and in fact always would have to find religious nationalism at issue from a Catholic perspective. That said, Steve Bannon claims to be Catholic, and I could go through the list of top Christian nationalist leaders in the United States, and you would be surprised how many of them claim to be Catholic.
Do we have any other questions for Dr. Schneck? Okay, thank you very much for this wonderful talk and for this great discussion.